when was the last time you got a splinter? You may have a splinter, right? I've had more splinters than I can count in my life. But I remember one particular one, and it was when I was installing drywall. And I wasn't wearing gloves, so if you've ever done this, you know, you kind of just, you put it up and you kind of run the screws in, but you're kind of guiding them with your other finger. And so the screw itself had some little metal spurs on it, and it went into my finger. And it was one of those that, it was so small. I mean, if you didn't put it under really bright light, you didn't even know you had it, except you could feel it. Right? You ever one of those? And every time you pushed your finger just wrong, you're like, ow, it's irritating. Now, here's the second question. Have you ever had one of those get infected? What happens when that or any other wound or hurt gets infected? You begin to protect it at all costs. Do you not? Because if you have something that's infected and someone bumps you, what happens? Ow! Ow, right? Like it's a disproportionate reaction. Like they just literally will brush by you and they hit it and your whole body just kind of convulses. You're like, ow, that hurt. And the reaction is actually in disproportion to the size of the splinter or something. It's like a cat on a hot tin roof. I mean, you have an infection and and until whatever is causing the infection is removed and the wound is taken care of, that reaction remains. That happens in our souls as well. We're in this series called Enemies of the Soul. It's all this idea about finding freedom and surrender, that as we surrender to God, He brings in freedom into our soul. Because even when we follow Jesus, He says, I'm going to give you a new heart, I'm going to give you a new life. You confess your sins, you forgive them, I forgive them, you turn your control of your life to me, I make you new, you're part of my family. But there's still junk that we got to deal with in our souls. So we want to find freedom. So we've been looking at that. And this idea that we're looking at today is this idea of wounds, because when we have these things that are infected in our lives, they cause disproportionate reactions. Let me ask you this. Have you ever had someone say, you're overreacting? Because they look at you and they think, that wasn't that big a deal. Why are you getting so up in my face? Why are you blowing up like this? It seems like it's disproportionate. Or how about this? Why are you getting so upset about this? It's no big deal. Why is this bothering you so much? Or, you know what? You're just blowing this all out of proportion. And you're thinking, no, I'm not. Why is this such a big deal to you? Or change these questions around. Why am I overreacting? Why does this bother me so much? Why am I getting so upset about this? I know in my head this isn't such a big deal, but man, it is triggering me. Why am I getting so angry all the time? Why does this bother me so much? Why is this such a big deal? Well, we're in week 4 of this series of Finding Surrender. And if you haven't been with us, we've been going through these things that war against our soul. They keep us from soul health. And when we talk about soul, we just mean the seat of our emotions, our desires, our decisions, where all that comes from in our lives. And we want that to be healthy, because when it's not, life is not like it should be. And so what we've looked at so far are 3 things. The enemy number 1 we looked at was this idea of having the wrong identity. We saw that if we don't see ourselves the way our Heavenly Father sees us, then everything we do in our lives is to shore up our identity, to make sure that we feel okay about ourselves, and it goes the wrong direction. Then we looked at this idea of unrepentance, where when we hold on to things, when we hold secrets, and we don't confess and bring those secrets to light, it prevents the kind of growth and health in us that only God can bring. And then last week, we looked at this idea of unforgiveness. When we harbor bitterness or anger towards other people, our souls are damaged, and we can't find freedom. Well, the enemy we're going to look at today is simply this: wounds. I'll give you an example. When I was very young, I had an event happen where I was humiliated, and I mean very young, like I was 5, okay? You're thinking, what could possibly happen at 5 years old that would damage you? But some of you know what I'm talking about. I was humiliated by a person who was very close to me, and that memory of that event burned itself into my memory. I could remember the emotion, I could remember what I felt, I could remember the anger, I could remember just the intensity of that emotion. And it kind of stuck with me, but I was really young, right? I was 5. So as I got older, I just said, it was no big deal. I was 5. I mean, you were a kid. I don't know anything. Not really that big a deal. except every once in a while, it would bump up in my memories and it would provoke a disproportionate reaction to me. There was still a strong emotion there. It colored my perceptions of this person who did this to me. And I would forget about it sometimes for years at a time, but it would always come back to me whenever I was made to feel stupid or humiliated, and it actually shaped and influenced how I interacted with people in my life. The truth of the matter is, every single person in this room has baggage from their past. Some of it recent, and some of it a long time ago. And those wounds, when they are not dealt with, are like a splinter that's infected. And when someone bumps up against it, it provokes this disproportionate reaction in our lives. And those wounds then begin to negatively affect our decisions. They affect our relationships. They affect our behaviors. And they're a limitation in our lives. Do you ever hear this quote? Time heals all wounds. Utter lie. Just not true. Do you know what time does? It scabs over wounds. Until the day where the scab gets ripped off and you realize it's not better. Time does not heal all wounds. Intentional action does. And what happens to us is we have these wounds, we just try and forget about them, we really don't like to think about it. We kind of erect fortresses or defense mechanisms that prevent us from ever having to think about it. We don't have to consider it. I mean, that's in the past. I'm not going to worry about it. We just kind of block it all out. But if we really want to have true healing in our souls, those walls, those defenses, they have to come down, and we have to let God deal with them. And here's the truth I want you to walk away with today, because while that's not true, here's what is true. Jesus' grace is big enough for our deepest wounds. It just is. But if we don't work to let this happen, then the trajectory in our life will be determined by the hurts that we've never dealt with. So, I'm going to do something a little different this morning. I want to tell you a story that'll help illustrate this purpose. It's a story from the Old Testament. It's in 2 Samuel. And it's a story that if you've been in church your whole life, you might be familiar with it. It's kind of a little side story. And if you have not been in church, this will be brand new to you. But it's the story of a guy named Ahithophel. Anybody know Ahithophel? Some of you might know who this is. And I'm going to give you a little background, because this takes place, as I said, in the book of 2 Samuel. We're going to look at some of these things, but it's the story of Ahithophel. And it happened after David had become king of Israel. Now, if you're at all familiar, David, right, the account of David's life, you remember it. He was this boy who was anointed by Samuel as the king when Saul was, he was the first king of Israel, but he blew it. And so God said, I'm going to pick someone after my own heart. And he picked David. David's just a teenager when he's anointed. And if you remember, he's the one who beats Goliath, right, with the sling, he throws the stone, and then he becomes popular, but he gets so popular that now the king wants to kill him, so he goes on the run. And he was part of Saul's court, but then he goes on the run for years. He actually spent 7 years running from Saul for his life. He thought he was going to die. And there's this whole series of events, and when Saul, the king, finally dies, David is anointed the king over Judah, which was just this southern piece of the kingdom. And then the north, Saul's son became king. But then there's this whole kind of internal civil struggle that happens. And after 7 more years of internal conflict, David ends up finally becoming king of the entire nation of Israel. So David is now the king. And he had received everything that God had promised him just by waiting and by trusting in God. So now he's the king. Now, excuse me. In those days, when a king was in charge, the king's word was law. That's just the way it worked, right? That's how they viewed things. So what the king said, go. The king said this, it happened. The wise kings, the smart kings, would surround themselves with counselors. They would surround themselves with people who were older, smarter, wiser, and these people would come alongside the king and they would give him advice. They would say, here's how you think you should deal with these other foreign nations. Here's how you should deal with economic policy, with domestic policy. And so they would surround themselves with these counselors that would help them govern well. In fact, we read stories of ones who didn't do this, or they surrounded themselves with terrible counselors, and it just ended poorly. Well, David, having spent all those years on the run and consolidating, he was smart. He said, I'm going to take this advice. So he had counselors that he surrounded himself with. And one of them was a guy by the name of Ahithophel. And Ahithophel was a guy who was a little older than David, actually a few years older than David, had some wisdom. And here's what we read. Because David would go to him for advice. He was one of his inner circle, his close confidants, his friends. And we read this, that now in those days, the advice of Ahithophel was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom being David's son, regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. In other words, this guy was so smart, he was so wise, he was so good, that he became one of David's most trusted counselors. And when he gave advice, it was like they were getting advice directly from God. Like, he paid attention to this. This was not just throwaway. This was a guy who gave all kinds of amazing advice. Actually, David had this elite group of soldiers. You can read about it in Scripture. The Bible's great. It has all kinds of cool stuff. They were actually famous nationwide, and they were called David's Mighty Men. I mean, it really sounds like a Marvel comic, right? I mean, they actually tell you what these guys did. They have all these exploits. It was fantastic. Well, Ahithophel's son, Eliam, was actually one of David's mighty men. So David has this connection. Ahithophel's son's part of his core band of these famous guys. Ahithophel's his counselor. In the middle of all this that's going on, David makes the biggest mistake of his life. Remember the story? Of course, it centered around a woman. Not her fault, that's the way it worked out. And her name was Bathsheba. That's right, we know this story. Because you remember the weather turned nice and the nations re-engaged in war. The reason they did that when it was nice is because they had to get all the crops planted first. And since a lot of the farmers doubled down as soldiers, they didn't want to go to war until the crops were planted, because if you went to war before that happened, then your nation starved later. So that, it was now, the crops were in, now they just had to grow, so the nations go off to war. You remember this? And David was supposed to be with his army, but he's not. He stays home, just chilling and enjoying being king, and he sees this beautiful woman from his palace roof and decides, he sees her bathing and says, oh, I got to get me some of that. I don't know what the language was, but that's what he thought. And so you remember the story. He inquired, he found out this is Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And by the way, in order to really grasp this story, you have to understand what's going on. When you read the story of David and Bathsheba, and he finds out this is Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, this isn't just a random guy. This wasn't David seeing someone and thinking, who's connected to this? He sees her. Remember, you don't have binoculars or telescopes. He's like, who is that woman? And they say, oh, that's Uriah's wife. And he's like, oh. Because Uriah was also one of the key 30 men in David's mighty men. David knew who this guy was. He had probably fought with him. So in fact, let's be honest, unless you're a significant guy, you're not living within sight of the palace. If this was just a random guy, he'd be way out on the edge of town. This is someone in the inner circle here where the nice houses were. He was part of David's inner sanctum. Uriah was part of that. So David knew the man. He understood his reputation, but his desire for Bathsheba is so strong that he calls her over, he sleeps with her, gets her pregnant. And you remember how the story goes. He finds out she's pregnant. He's like, well, I want to hide this. I don't want anybody to know what I did. So he manipulates events. He tries to get Uriah to come back from the battlefield and tries to manipulate him to being with his wife so that somehow he thinks that it's his kid and it's not David's kid, but it doesn't work because Uriah has integrity and honor. And when it doesn't work, David arranges for Uriah's death. You remember that? And then when he was dead, David said, I'm going to take Bathsheba as my wife. And David is eventually confronted by the prophet Nathan. He said, well, you can't do this. And there's this whole period, and you can actually read Psalm 51, is when David finally comes to the place where he's just crushed by his sin. He says, I can't believe I did this. I have sinned against God. He's undone. He's broken. And so he repents, and he humbles himself before God, but the damage is done. The man is dead. And here's where the intrigue really takes off. Because David had a son named who? Those of you who've been in church long enough? Absalom. That's right. We saw his name earlier. Now, Absalom was the king's son. He had aspirations. He wanted to be king. He wasn't the oldest, so that wouldn't naturally fall to him, but he wanted to be king. And so due to a lot of other issues going on in the kingdom, David's kind of ignoring Absalom. He's not paying a lot of attention to him. So Absalom begins to lobby for influence and power. He was ambitious. He wanted the kingship. So what Absalom did is he said he started to spend time with people. He listened to their complaints. He told them, hey, look, I'm not your king, but if I was your king, this is what I would do. Literally political advertisement. I'm not your president, but if I was, here's what I do. This is what Absalom did. He did it for 2 or 3 years. He's like, I can do better than him. I mean, I know I can't, but I mean, if I could, I'm in your corner. I would do what you want. And to make it all better, Absalom was drop dead gorgeous, right? So everybody liked him. He kind of was a man's man. And so, I mean, he just grabbed the hearts of the people. And that's what we're told, where he begins to steal the hearts of the people away from his father, David. And here is where Ahithophel enters our story again. Well, Absalom was offering sacrifices. In other words, he's putting on this great show of being pious. He's not only winning the people's heart. He says, look, I'm a God follower like my father. He also sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, to come from Gilo, his hometown. Understand what's happening here, because look at the following sentence. And so the conspiracy gained strength, and Absalom's following kept on increasing. He's more and more popular. He says, Ahithophel, my dad's inner circle. I know you. You know me. You've watched me grow up. Come be with me. Give me advice. And Ahithophel begins to play both sides of the fence. Interesting. Because Ahithophel, David's counselor, his trusted advisor, is now advising Absalom. The one who had spent years helping David establish his kingdom was now operating in both camps. Still working with David, but now he's working with Absalom. Well, the conspiracy gains enough traction over time that it actually comes to a tipping point where a message comes to David, hey, David, you've lost the people. The bulk of them are now behind Absalom. They're not behind you. And Absalom had gained most of the people. Look what we read. A messenger came and told David, the hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom. And David said to his officials and who were with him in Jerusalem, come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. In other words, we got to act now, because he's got enough people that if we don't get out of town, we're dead. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin on us and put the city to the sword. David had to run so that he would not get caught in the city. And if he did, all of his trusted friends and advisors would be killed, except for Ahithophel. So they ran. They escaped the city. The king became a fugitive. Absalom, his son, began this coup to take over. And all the time this is going on, Ahithophel is giving Absalom advice on how to make this happen. He is now fully in David's son's camp. He was actively working against the man who he had counseled and been a friend to for probably the better part of 2 decades. And his advice to Absalom actually reveals that his goal wasn't simply to give Absalom the kingship. Ahithophel wanted to humiliate and destroy David. Look at the advice he gave to Absalom. Absalom said to Ahithophel, give us your advice. What should we do? All right, I got control of the city. David's on the run. What do I do? Ahithophel answered, sleep with your father's concubines whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious to your father, and the hands of everyone with you will be more resolute. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he slept with his father's concubines in the sight of Israel. Absalom defiled his father's wives. It was his statement that says, this kingship is mine, and I will despoil what belonged to my father. He used sex to humiliate his dad. But Ahithophel is not done. He goes on. Ahithophel said to Absalom, I would choose 12,000 men, set out tonight in pursuit of David. In other words, David's just run. He has left the city. He's on the run. He's not very far. Pick 12,000 men, attack him while he's weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I would strike down only the king. Catch that? Only the king. and bring the people back to you. He didn't just want David humiliated, he wanted him dead. Attack now, Absalom. I know your father. I know what he's like. He will never be more vulnerable than he is right now. Kill him. Take him out. But there's a twist in the story. Because David had a confidant named Hushai. Someone who had been also in David's inner circle. Not a kind of a counselor like Ahithophel, but someone who's his friend. And as David's on the run, David has this idea. He says, I want you to go back and pretend to be on Absalom's side, just like Ahithophel is. And I want you to give advice to Absalom, but what I want you to do is give him bad advice. In fact, whatever Ahithophel tells Absalom to do, tell him to do the opposite. You're a persuasive guy, you can make it work. His job, that was his job, to go back and kind of be like a spy inside Absalom's camp. Now, Ahithophel's advice, this advice that he gave, was the best advice. It was actually the right advice. But when Hushai came and gave this other advice, it seemed better to Absalom. And Absalom decided to follow Hushai's advice instead of Ahithophel. And when that happened, Ahithophel saw the writing on the wall because he could just see what was coming. He realized that his entire plan to take down David had failed. He had banked on his whole future on David's death and Absalom becoming king. And Absalom's reign in his place, and now he could see it all come crashing down. And so here's what we read. This was part of his plan. Here's what we read. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order and then he hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb. And in the end, the coup failed. Absalom was killed. David was returned to the kingship. But I wondered, what about Ahithophel? What happened to him? What caused a man to turn against a trusted friend? What caused a man to go from being a trusted advisor for years to the king to an enemy? Why? And Scripture doesn't tell us directly, but we're given some information that can help us. If you remember earlier in the story, we saw this. And this is just when the author's giving you some context of who people are. We read this Eliphelet, son of Hashabai, the Machlite, and then he says, Eliam, the son of Ahithophel, the Elonite. So Ahithophel had a son named Eliam. We saw that already. This is not new information. But there's one other verse that will help us. And it was this verse here. David sent men someone to find out about her. This is after he saw her. The man said, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Do you see this? Uriah, who David had killed, was married to Ahithophel's granddaughter. Ahithophel was in David's court when he committed adultery with his granddaughter. He was advising David when David had his granddaughter's husband murdered. He worked in the palace and saw the children that David had with his granddaughter. And he could do nothing. And every day he was reminded of David's treachery, and it created deep, deep soul wounds. And I can only imagine what was going on in him, but when he saw the chance to get revenge, he did. David committed adultery with my granddaughter, so Absalom, sleep with all his wives. You know what? You killed the husband of my granddaughter. Absalom, he needs to die. And you can only wonder how those wounds festered in his heart and consumed him and changed the entire course of his life, and in the end it caused his death. Soul wounds have the power to poison our souls. They steal our joy and they rob us from freedom. And some of you today have wounds that are still festering in your soul from your past. It's caused you to dislike, even hate another person. It's caused you to build barriers, to put up shields. These wounds have impacted you so that when you speak, when you open up, how many risks you take, it's all been like that. But my friends, Jesus' grace is bigger than our deepest wounds. So the question is, how do we keep from becoming a Ahithophel? Let me just give you 3 ideas, 3 things. And here's step 1. Trust that God wants to heal your wounds so He can deepen His relationship with you. You have to understand, in the wounds that are in your life, you have to understand God's purpose. God never causes the wounds. It was never His will for a father to abuse his daughter. He doesn't make it so that your close friend has a catastrophic falling out from you. He doesn't make someone abandon their family. But when these wounding events happen, because we live in this awful, sinful, broken world, God says, if you will let me, I will work with you in this. I will change you. I want to make you more like me and restore this relationship. This is what Scott read to us early. Surely He took up our pain, He bore our suffering. This is Isaiah prophesying years after David, but long before Jesus, saying we consider Him, Jesus, punished by God, stricken by Him, afflicted. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. In other words, all those things that happened on the cross, all the suffering that happened to Jesus, the punishment that came on Him brought us peace. And by His wounds, we are healed. Jesus wants to bring peace to every part of our lives, including the wounds of our souls. He doesn't send pain, but He is so good and so loving that He can redeem it in us, if we let Him. And I can stand before you today, and I think most people can, and I can categorically tell you that I've learned more from my failures than my successes, and I have grown more in my pain than in my prosperity. Because here's the thing, we can't be more interested in comfort than we are in wholeness. And I get it, guys. We want to feel better. We want to alleviate the symptoms. We want to alleviate the pain. The truth is, though, that if God just waved a magic wand and fixed us, most of us, many of us, would walk away from any meaningful relationship with God because we wouldn't need it anymore. Remember, the goal is not to feel better. We want to. I know that. We desperately do. I know that. Anytime I've been wounded, all I want is to not think about it, get away from it, not deal with it anymore. I just want to feel better. But God says, no, it's better than that. Yeah, I get that. But I want you and me to be good. And in that process, you will feel better. When we come to the conclusion and understand that God deeply cares, He was not absent during your wounding experiences, and He deeply desires for you to become whole by turning to Him. But that leads us to step 2, really important. That means we have to understand what they are. We have to take responsibility for the wounds of our lives and own them. Most wounds that you have, that I have, are caused by other people. Let's be honest. Most of the wounds we have in our lives are usually triggered by, caused by someone else. But we will only find healing when we say, all right, I get it. It wasn't me. I was a kid. That should never have happened to me. That wasn't my fault. But you know what? They're not going to fix it for me. I need to engage with God to make this happen. And why is this important? Because if you don't do this, what will happen is you'll keep dealing with the presenting problem all the time. It's like going to a doctor, right? You find out recently you've been losing weight. It's been falling like crazy. Like not the kind of weight we all want to lose, but I mean the really bad kind, where you're just losing weight. And you go to the doctor, and the doctor says, well, you just need to eat more. So you eat more, and you keep on losing weight. And this keeps going on in cycle after cycle. What do you need to find out? You need to find out what's really wrong when he says, oh, you have diabetes. the treatment begins to change. You never get better until you reach the underlying problem. And so for a lot of us, we're just like, well, I'm just angry all the time. I don't know why I'm so angry. I'm just angry. And I get angry and I blow up at people and I have road rage and we just keep on trying to say, well, just don't be angry. Don't be angry. It doesn't work. Because there's a wound underneath. There's something that's messing us up. David was so good at this. Look at these verses. Really interesting. In Psalm 55, this is what David wrote. He said, if an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If a foe was rising against me, I could hide. In other words, I would get that. But it's you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend, with whom I once enjoyed sweet fellowship at the house of God as we walked about in the worshipers. That's the person that's messed up. Look at this. He says it in another place. Even my close friend, someone I trusted who shared my bread, has turned against me. And David is saying, I've been wounded. And I wonder if either of those was written about Ahithophel. Certainly fits the bill, doesn't it? I've had people tell me in the past, hey, look, the past is the past, just get over it. Why would you go around digging it up? Just let sleeping dogs lie. I got news for you. You cannot get freedom from that which you will not confront. When I was going to a counselor as part of my master's program, we had to do this in a spiritual formation class. The exercise they gave me, they said, we want you to write a grief journal. So what's a grief journal? So we want you to start at the beginning of your life and write down every hurtful wound that's ever happened to you that you can remember. And I thought, I grew up in a Christian home. I had good parents, got along, never really had any problems. How bad could it be? 7 pages later. Okay? You guys, if you went back and you start to think, you're like, oh yeah, I remember that. I remember how I felt. It was awful. I remember when they made fun of me. I remember when this happened. I remember when they walked away from me. I remember when that friendship ended and the wounds. When we do that, it's like, okay, I'm admitting that they exist. I'm not even at the place of fixing them yet, but you know what? That happened. It was a thing, and it just about wrecked me. What did it do to my soul? How did it change the course of my life? How is it still impacting me? But it doesn't stop there, because the last step is to let God actually heal your soul. It's a great theological truth that I want to share with you. God knows stuff, and He wants to tell you. There you go. Best theology you'll get all morning. Right? God knows stuff. He knows everything. And you know what? He's not trying to hide it from you. And He's like, no, I want you to trust me. I get this. I understand your wounds better than you do. But when you begin to admit them and bring them to me, I will help you. And sometimes it happens all at once, and sometimes it happens over a long period of time. Sometimes it's intimately connected with the need to forgive, which is why we talked about forgiveness last week. But sometimes we have forgiven to the best of our ability, and we still have the hurts of the wounds. God's like, we got to dig that splinter out. In fact, if you go back to those last 2 Psalms that we just read, and you were to continue to read, look, remember He said, if an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If this was going on, if it wasn't for this person being so close to me, I could deal with it. But I've been wounded. But He goes on to say this, but as for me, I call to God. The Lord saves me. Evening, morning, and noon, I cry out in distress. He hears my voice. And He ends with this very famous verse, cast your cares on the Lord, and He will sustain you. He will never let the righteous be shaken. That last line. Or the other one, where He said, even my close friend, someone I trusted who shared my brother, turned against me. He went on to say in that same psalm, but may you have mercy on me, God. Raise me up that I may repay them. I know that you're pleased with me, for my enemy doesn't triumph over me. My integrity, because of my integrity, you uphold me. Set me in your presence. Praise be the Lord, the God of Israel, from everlasting to everlasting. In other words, David's going through saying, look, I am so deeply wounded by this, but you know what? God, you will meet me where I'm at. Let Him minister you. Let Him reveal your heart. Let Him speak words of healing into your soul. Let Him release you from anger and bitterness and blame. Hear Him when He tells you how much you mean to Him and how much He genuinely loves you and cares for you. Jesus' grace is big enough for our deepest wounds. And Jesus endured pain on the cross so that your pain can be brought to Him. He suffered death on the cross so you can put to death what is damaging your soul. Jesus was wounded deeply by those closest to Him, so He gets it. He willingly gave himself to suffer. He willingly gave himself to woundedness so that he can redeem ours for something better. My friends, we live in a damaged world. It's just part of living in a damaged world. We have wounds from our past, and you're going to get wounded again in the future, but our wounds do not have to define who we are. They don't have to cause you to react poorly to others or to circumstances. God says, no, I want to use your wounds to draw me to myself. I want you to understand them so you can process them. Let me do it. It was only in my 40s that I finally sat down to process the hurt that I had mentioned at the beginning of our time together. And my mind went back through the experience, and I thought about what I felt. I thought about why. I reviewed what made the event so hurtful in my life, even though I was only 5 years old, and why it had stuck with me for 40 years. And then I went through the event with Jesus, and I let him speak truth into my soul about who I was and that he was with me even then. And the memory lost its power. I found healing. I found freedom. May God grant you freedom as you bring your wounds to him. Will you stand as I pray? And then let's close in worshiping Jesus together. God, we know a couple things for sure from your word. One is that you never designed this world to have these kind of wounds, these kind of problems. You designed it perfectly. You wanted us to be in communion with you, with each other. It was going to be amazing. And then when we sinned, we broke it. And so now we live in a broken world where people wound other people, where hurts happen. And God, every one of us is the recipient of these things. And yet, God, that doesn't have to define who we are. It doesn't have to change the course of our life. And so we come to you as those who want to turn our wounds over to you, even if we don't know how. So this morning we take the first step to acknowledge what it is, to acknowledge that we have them, and to invite you into the process of doing that together. Thank you that you love us so much, that you've already proven through the cross what you're willing to do on our behalf. May we come to you and trust you in all. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Hey, we're going to sing these last two songs, and then as we close, we will have people at the front too. If you want them to pray with you, if there's something you just want to process, or you just want someone to pray over the wounds or hurts or any other sickness or issue that you have this morning, they would be happy to do that. But in the meantime, let's sing.